Welcome, everyone. We are very lucky to have Simon de la Rouviere with us today to speak about some of his work on Harberger tax, and hopefully it'll be a very interesting discussion because, of course, we've been doing a lot of work too. So take it away, Simon.
Awesome.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Simon, obviously, as Jason mentioned. I've been in the blockchain space for a few years and have enjoyed a lot of time thinking about new sort of economic models and economic incentive models. And a part of that isn't something that I invented, but I thought was a really interesting idea, which is Harberger tax, or it goes by other names such as COST, which is Common Ownership Self-Assessed Tax. There's also SALSA, which is Self-Assessed Licensing. And it all comes down to the sort of core principle of, you self-assess a specific asset, and whilst you're setting a price, you pay some tax rate. That I originally saw that from Radical Markets, and as everyone at Wildcards knows, and the audience of Wildcards know, like, this is something that should be fairly familiar. And so I launched like the first collectible that does this. You use this model, and I created a project called This Artwork is Always on Sale. And since March 2019, the artwork has always been on sale. And has netted me as the artist some funds, and that's the Wildcards team took the code and made everything a lot better. So that's where we are today.
Jason, why don't you let us quickly bring up the website? I think it's a great time to actually bring up.
Yeah. Okay.
Or you can do it. You've got admin mode. There we go. Can you see it over here? I've got this massive screen, so it's a little bit hectic.
Zoom in.
You can see this is the original one, which is insane, and this is the code we forked, and that sort of started everything. And you can see it's done really well. And something I guess we'll talk a bit about is this Harberger tax rate, which is a percentage of the sale price, and depending on what this rate is, I guess that can affect the value and the velocity of all of these items and everything like that. So that's also something that's super interesting to chat about.
Oh, wow.
But we should.
The price, something I've noticed, the price of your art, the new art, has gone down. That's new. That's really interesting. What do you think of that?
It's been fluctuating. Well, I mean, I think with any like new asset that's launched, I think there's initially like some speculative value in there where people are like, let me buy quickly, set the sort of deposit to only like 2 days from now, and then hopefully someone buys it for me. So I think like the early buyers usually are like more speculative, but I think that's fine as part of the sort of interplay between this new kind of asset. But yeah, like, I've been interested in figuring out what like effective tax rates are for these kind of assets. And I don't necessarily think there's a right answer, but it's definitely, I feel like it's definitely like a new sort of research space that makes one question which is the best tax rate. And so like the initial one was 5% because I was just thinking, I was taking cues from what the regional papers, the cost monopoly, the monopoly is another name, that paper suggests something in that range for assets if you don't know what you should choose. But I don't think that's necessarily the right choice generally, mostly because traditionally with most assets that the original academic research focused on assets where you could at least do some kind of investment into the asset. Like you can improve it. Like if you buy a house, you can build a new deck for your house, or repaint it or whatever. And there was still a desire that like, hey, like I don't want to get rid of this in like 2 months from now. Like, I want to live here for like 5 to 10 years. So the tax rates had to be low to account for that sort of turnover or expected turnover, and at least like allow this asset to be productively used. But a collectible, or as it stands now, at least, like the current set of collectibles, or at least like the artwork project, there's no improvement vector. Like, you can't take the collectible and like add your own mark to it. It's something I thought about. It's like, maybe that should be part of your privilege as the owner of this art collectible, is to decide like, hey, I want to add a scribble here. And that is your investment that you put into the artwork. And then it feels more in line with sort of it being a collective commons-like asset. But if it doesn't have any sort of reason to invest, then your choice becomes, how often should this thing change hands? And obviously, the higher the rate, the lower the prices will tend to be, and the more likely it will change hands. And so when I saw the first one, it's like 5%. It effectively amounts to saying, if it's 5% a year, you're effectively saying there's a 5% chance this year that it will change hands of potentially interested people. And obviously, it didn't change hands. And for the version 2, I was like, okay, well, let me up the rate significantly and then see what the response is. But I think art as well, there's a different kind of interplay too, versus say conservation collectibles, where art in itself sometimes gets value if people just value it higher. It's like, oh my God, there's a new Jeff Koons sculpture, and because all the previous sculptures were valued at millions of dollars, this one must also be worth millions of dollars. So now that you have this tax rate, it's like it changes a lot of vectors, and it's not certain which one should be like the best choice, and it differs, like I said, between art and conservation. So that was like a lot of thinking still, and I don't know which ones the best ones are.
That's super interesting.
Makes a lot of sense. Jason, go over it.
So I guess one of the sort of questions I think a lot of people will have, and I think you're right, it depends. For art, it's different to conservation tokens or sort of rights tokens, where when you own the token, you can use something or have rights to a revenue stream.
Like a license, yeah.
Yeah, like a license. But for your artwork, what would you say are the primary motivations for people to own it and buy it?
Yeah.
And what sort of stops it from being almost a Ponzi scheme, where it's like I buy in quick and hope someone buys it off me, and
I mean,
how do you balance that?
Yeah, because it's only a collectible and there's no necessarily productive value from the asset. The core sort of incentives to own this is still one, like the same reason why digital collectibles exist. People like owning things and saying it's theirs, even if it's a digital collectible. But I think the bigger factor is that it is an avenue for patronage. And it doesn't mean like all art needs to be like this, but like you could say like maybe as an artist, you would have a portfolio of these kind of artworks that you transform into these kind of digital collectibles that just gives, say, a patron or a fan or an artist a way to give back while still also having the experience of being a collector of your art or the collector of what you create. It doesn't necessarily has to be art. It could be like, what if we do this for like blog posts? I don't know, or like tweets. So it's an avenue for the artist, or like it's an avenue for a patron to give back. And this is actually like, I did manage to get in touch with the owner of the first version of the artwork, and that was what they said. They said that is like a key factor why they still want to be an owner. Like they're saying, hey, like Simon, like I appreciate all the things you've done and say the open source contributions to the space, and this is my way to own like that, a piece of history and a piece of a way to give back to what you did for the community. And so that to me at least says like, great, like this is the patronage model. Like if other artists did the same, I can do the same. Like I want to support you and own something at the same time. But yeah, so if on that sense, then you still have the question of like, what should the tax rate be for these kind of collectibles? It's still a standard question.
Yeah, I guess.
On that,
go for it, Darren.
I'm kidding. I was also going to jump in. Darren.
okay, so on that, the tax rate. So we've spoken quite a bit about it, and it's quite interesting, these kind of incentives that it makes fluctuating that kind of tax rate. And again, coming to like, maybe if that asset you own can appreciate in value, like a house where you build a deck and you can actually add things to it to expand its value. It's really trying to marry that tax rate to the actual asset, the underlying asset. And then the question is, with something like because the model is a little bit complicated already, but if you could have a model where the tax rate was a bit dynamic, so there was a series of features that kind of made that tax rate fluctuate based on the underlying value or perceived value. So right now, with the low tax rate, there's quite an incentive to pump and dump at first, and that's where you get those like kind of scam traders that come in and set the price high but don't have a deposit because there's like a large gearing or essentially your 10x your investment quite high when the Harberger tax rate is quite low. So what are your thoughts around kind of a dynamic tax rate, and then how would you model that?
Yeah, I think it's because there's like different variables that you can change of the setup, and I think you're right in assessing that one can choose to target a specific outcome, right? If you want to target a specific turnover, then you set the tax rate a specific amount, hoping it will turn over that many times during a year. And you could be right, it could be dynamic in a sense that if it hasn't turned over a certain amount of times, then the tax rate automatically starts creeping up if you choose to target turnover rate as part of it. Or if it's turning over too much, then the tax rate starts going down, for example.
Okay, yeah. Linking it to the turnover rate.
Auto balancing. My thinking with the I spoke to Jason about this as well, where my thinking was like the goal should be to maximize the amount of patronage that's being paid, right? The amount of tax revenue coming from this asset, which means that you would then have to find like a tax rate. It would probably be something like, if it's a very low tax rate, like let's say 0.0001%, you're not going to get the most patronage. If it's like a tax rate of 10 million% a year, you're also not going to get the most amount of patronage. So somewhere in the middle of these extremes is like probably like a bell curve. Somewhere in the middle, you'll find the optimal tax rate to incentivize people to participate in this, to feel like they can participate in the ownership of this asset and contribute patronage, while also interplaying with the price. But I don't like it. You might not want to target like max patronage as well.
Do you not think maybe that max patronage doesn't exist? And if someone comes into a system, say Wildcards or something, listen, I want to give $20 a month, and that means if the tax rate is 100%, I'm going to set the price at $20. If it's 5%, I'm going to set the price at $1,000, but I'm going to keep the patronage I give the same. That could also maybe, I don't know.
That is exactly something that's also a choice you can make and say like, what variables should we try to keep constant and what should change. And if you want to say like, hey, like someone can only pay $20 a month, then the system would auto balance the price, or choose a specific asset automatically for them, or what have you. So it's like that too is an option. But I think everything changes once again. Like if there's more rights attached or more capability attached to the collectible, because like in Wildcards, you get like these loyalty tokens, right? Or like the dragon, Glenn the dragon, which gives you access to decide what to do with the funds that's collected from this dragon, right? So there's different things that immediately then start changing what's the optimal choice. And the academic literature is only really sort of for in real life assets. Some people have spoken, like Matthew Pruitt, on intellectual property, but like a collectible is still sort of detached from anything that's come with the existing literature.
I think a good example, or maybe something we should chat hypothetically about, is something that's got more use, and something we were speaking to Kevin a bit about, is for Gitcoin building bounty slots, like the featured bounty slots that are have Harberger tax banners, etc. So users who want to promote their bounties on the Gitcoin website can essentially buy these collectible assets, which is just the right to essentially display their bounty on the front page. And that's, I guess, that is productive in the sense that it's more than just maybe a collectible. And I wonder what an optimal tax rate for something like that would be. It's just an interesting thing to think of.
Yeah. Actually, like the original code that I wrote for this artwork is always in sale came from code that I think the name is Todd Probstring and Billy Rennekamp. Billy Rennekamp wrote Harberger ads, which is like some of the initial code, and so I forked that to make this artwork always on sale. I don't necessarily. My gut feeling is that, like, in the Web 2.0 space, where we've seen ad models being basically perfected to some extent, like through like Victory auctions and other kind of auction models, that maybe that is still good enough. The only benefit you get from the sort of self-assessed pricing for ads is that you have some. I think it would be interesting if you have then some additional capability or like additional value that comes from being an owner for a certain period of time, rather than, which I don't think you have access to with things like Victory auctions and stuff like that, where you like buy ad time or ad space for a certain amount of clicks or something. And I think maybe that's where something like what you guys are doing with the loyalty tokens comes in. Like, what if the ad revenue collected from those Gitcoin ad slots can go towards funding the Gitcoin grants or something, and then like you are displayed as one of the patrons that contributed to the Gitcoin grants. I don't know, something like that.
I've got another sort of question. I think we've spoken quite a lot about the benefits of Harberger tax, and I think maybe it would be really interesting to speak about, maybe downsides is the wrong word, but the sort of issues. For example, I mean, when Denim was mentioning a dynamic Harberger tax, that's super interesting, and I really love the idea to try and experiment with that. But then you run into problems where if you build it like current Harberger tax systems, where it's totally open and permissionless and also anonymous, it's so prone to manipulation. I can say, oh, I want the tax rate to be high, so I start trading it with myself, or I want the tax rate to be low. So you can really start to think of ways where someone can pretend to be lots of people, and the system doesn't really detect that. So I almost wonder how important would Sybil resistance need be for Harberger tax, or is it a feature that it's all anonymous? What sort of manipulation do you think we have to watch out for?
Yeah, so I think it's like if you're tracking, say, if you're tracking turnover rate, for example, then you could just wash trade amongst different Ethereum accounts. So then you need like more specific identity systems to realize this is actually changing hands from a separate person to another separate person. Something that people have mentioned about this artwork is always on sale is like, and to some extent you guys too, but maybe not so much, is in the artwork project, I am the patron that receives the tax revenue. So if I choose to own the artwork, it's at no cost to myself besides gas costs, right? So I can decide to buy the artwork and then put the price whatever I wanted to, because I'm just paying myself, right? So in that sense, I can inflate the value, and no one will be none the wiser. No one would know if it was me, if I did that. So they have to trust that I wouldn't do that. So there's like a vector there where it's just like, okay, like this works because we trust Simon wouldn't be that person that's going to artificially inflate the value of this artwork, which might not be the case in other circumstances. Like you would have to trust the artist in that sense, or at least the beneficiaries. Like you can probably include some additional cost, like fees or vectors there that makes it more costly for me to do so. You could do something like, okay, well, not all the money goes to me. Like 20% goes to some other fund that supports underrepresented artists, or like just like a diversity fund or whatever. Then it makes more sense that I couldn't do that because I would lose 20% of my funds every time. So there are some downsides there depending on who the beneficiaries are, because you can sort of fake the system. I do also think that like Harberger tax in general, should when one designs a system like that, I think like a key factor one should always answer is that should this ought this to be owned in the commons, right? As like just like a small heuristic that one asked the question for. And I think that's where like conservation or like patronage helps, because we want to support the commons in some way. So in the case of the artwork project, it's not necessarily that the case, but as you can see, like people support me because the things that I produce ends up in the commons, right? So it's like here's open source code, or here's like writing and research or sharing of ideas and things like that. So I did think it doesn't obviously work for all kinds of assets, and it could be actually harmful for certain kind of assets to use this sort of property rights model. So yeah, I think there are definitely some downsides, and I think it just depends on the kind of asset or what you want to do with it. But I think like the design space is still massive, very very big still,
For sure,
that we can experiment with.
So with wildcards, they I mean, definitely sort of questions that are different to you. I mean, an organization could own their own artwork, or wash trade their own artwork. Sorry, not artwork, wildcard. But I guess at the moment they totally could do that. We aren't taking any fees, but in the future we will have some fees. So at least there's sort of disincentive for that. But then there's other questions of how many NFTs should we have per organization? How many NFTs should we have in total? One of the limitations that we've run into is, if I think at the moment we've got 23. Someone correct me. I think we've got 23 wildcards, so not very many. And that means maximum we've got 23 users, at any given point in time. Which is quite a big limit. So that's why we're really looking to change certain models or have different models of contribution. So not everyone has to use the Harberger tax. But, the question is, let's say we had thousands of wildcards, maybe they all non-fungible, but that it changes the dynamic when you've got hundreds of them. You could have, I don't know, maybe a new type of company just to think about this, where you have 1,000 NFTs, and each NFT represents 0.1% ownership of that company, and all of them are always for sale. You could try that. I don't know. What do you think of that intersection and between number and uniqueness and all of that?
Yes, still, like, there's so many interesting questions still. I've actually thought about that as well too, and I think like the same argument applies to the tax rate. Like, if you have one collectible, right, you're not going to capture the most value from giving away this kind, or like building this kind of product. But if you have like 10 billion, 20 billion collectibles, you're like diluting the value of there being a collectible at all, right? Then it's just like, why don't we just give money directly to conservation? So like somewhere in the middle again is there's like an optimal space where there's like enough collectibles that is meaningful versus the extremes. And I think one way to determine this is to have like an internal threshold. Let's say it's per organization, right? Because I think the categories would be around an organization. Like every organization would be its category. Every organization as a category would have a certain amount of collectibles, and you then choose what that threshold is. But let's say the overall collected, it's obviously determined by the tax rate and the price together. But you say like, if there is, say, $1,000 a month coming into this organization, mint a new collectible, right? And if that then dilutes the value as a whole, you would see this category, the economic value, sort of go down. And then you set another threshold which says, if this collectible hasn't had a price of, say, $100 for the whole year, it's taken out of circulation, or it's like decommissioned. And then when there's like interest again in this organization, if you can take it back out of the wings and bring it back to center stage. So there's interplay between saying like, if this economy grows, mint more collectibles, because there's clearly demand for this organization's collectibles, mint a new one. If there isn't demand, take some back. That's what I think could be a cool model, but like obviously it's not perfect, because you by there being collectibles, you generate demand. So there needs to be some interplay between like saying we will introduce new ones or we will remove some from circulation.
I'm really curious on what you mean by remove from circulation. We've tried to think of it, but it's quite a difficult thing to do when they always for sale. So I don't know if you've got ideas about that.
So one of those ideas that I had was a simple threshold is simply if it ever goes to a foreclosed state, right? As in like someone exits out of the usage of the thing, or the price is zero for some reason, then it's done. It can't be bought again. But that's probably extreme, because obviously someone can buy it and then immediately just foreclose and destroy the collectible. But it could be something like, if the price is zero for like a week, take it out of circulation, because there's clearly no interest. But in that case, like, you're not taking away anything from anyone, because no one's currently owning it. No one is paying patronage. It's just zero. It just sits there and doing nothing. So take it out of circulation.
Super interesting. I've got a thesis that I'm not sure I agree with, but I'll throw it out there. I think if there are thousands of tokens in the future, there'll be a sort of graveyard of these tokens. And if they are just always for sale, the opportunity cost of someone just buying it for a tiny amount and setting it for a few cents is so low. I almost feel the long, you almost don't have to worry about the graveyard tokens, because if the transaction costs are lower in the future, I think that's the big hurdle. Maybe we don't have to worry about that so much it'll kind of sort itself out. Just
I think
an idea.
That's true. Like the price floor would essentially just be like the transaction costs for owning these things. But I think that the enabling sort of this graveyard thing, it can work, but I think the negative thing of having this graveyard of collectibles is that it reduces people's interest to get involved in the first place. It's the same thing when, say, someone gets to CryptoKitties now and goes like, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of CryptoKitties there are, and you see suddenly you're overwhelmed. It's like, why would I want this one if I don't know how unique or valuable this one is? So I'm not getting involved. So that token then now sits there in this graveyard because someone went in and said, well, there's too many options. I don't want to participate. So I think you want to reduce that in sort of that negative incentive there. You want people to when they see the options go like, I am going to get something unique. Like that's great. So it could be something like, instead it could be something like if the tokens trade under a certain threshold, then for a certain period of time, let's say under like $10 for a year, then what happens is there's a possibility for the protocol to buy this asset for $10 and take it out of circulation. So let's say for in say Wildcards case, put 1% of all funds into a pool that can then buy back these assets over time if they're not useful. So that you still keep this feeling of there being only a handful of unique ones available that serves the demand of this economy, but there isn't sort of an overwhelming amount of collectibles. It's this graveyard feeling, like something like sometimes things like CryptoKitties feels like. It's like there's too many. It's too many of them. So you need like some sink in the economy to remove some out of circulation.
Yeah, I really love that idea. It's great. I think people talk about money Legos a lot in Ethereum and in DeFi, and I think these could be a sort of patronage Lego where it's like, hey, you're a company, you want to do good, remove tokens from circulation. That's doing good, or like there's so many different ways that you can benefit the whole economy, probably in an amplified effect. When these systems interact, like I think an example is the grassroots economy project. I think I'm saying that wrong, but that project in Kenya, it's a community currency thing. And the idea is that you put in $100 to this community, and because that $100 sort of ignites more trading, you create thousands of dollars in economic activity. So I feel there's a lot to explore in that area. What do you think? How do you think these protocols might interact with the rest of DeFi, the rest of other companies working in the space? Do you think there will be synergy? Quite an abstract question, but
yeah,
maybe you have an idea.
I think there should be more synergy, at least like experimenting, because like one thing, for example, that the way the current sort of Harberger tax models work is like you require a deposit, right? So that's like an opportunity cost that you take on, which is like your capital sitting there inert. It's not being used for anything else besides trickling away money to the patron or the beneficiary. But parts of that capital could be actually productively used in DeFi. Put some of those deposits in. Obviously, if the users agree, like take some of those deposits with their consent and have it earn like interest, and that also goes to either paying the platform, paying conservation, or what have you. So that's like a money Lego component where it's just like there's this capital here. Maybe put it more to more productive use. Some other examples. There's a project called Niftify. Not sure if you've heard about it, where people are you can like lend out your NFTs. You can borrow and lend against NFTs. So if I have a digital collectible, I can take out a loan against the collectible, and if I don't repay, then the borrower, you forfeit your NFT, and the borrower gets the NFT. And that's like super simple, and it just works really great, and it allows people to create liquidity around their assets. It does present a unique problem for Harberger assets, because like if it's in a collateral somewhere and someone buys it, then obviously it's not inside the collateral anymore. But that could be part of the risk that the borrower takes on, or sorry, the lender, right? It's like I'm going to lend
or the
money
lender
to you.
gets the money from the sale.
Oh, of course, yeah. Sorry, yeah, that's actually how you do it. That could also be the case. So it's like, there is another way, I think, which you can combine some of these money Legos. What's some other options? I think another thing that could be interesting is that because these Harberger collectibles present a continuous cash flow, like versus say something like Super Rare, where an artist only gets funds from a secondary sale. With the artwork is always on sale, I get funds every 15 seconds, right? A little trickle of funds. So there's sort of, if the price at least remains stable, then you can project cash flow really well into the future, right? Versus say, you don't know when you might get a secondary sale of your artwork in Super Rare. So I think that's valuable as well for people to sort of maybe collateralize their payments and take out loans or leverage against that. And that's where things like maybe Centrifuge can be useful. I don't know if you know of Centrifuge. For the people that don't know Centrifuge, their goal is to essentially tokenize invoices, right? And then allow people to take loans against or advances against those invoices. So if you have an invoice that says in 90 days you're going to get paid, but you need that money now, you could tokenize that invoice, take out a loan against that invoice, and then continue what you're doing elsewhere. So it's like it gives you immediate access to cash flow, obviously at a cost, and then obviously someone provides that funds to you, and then eventually the invoice gets paid, and the lender gets additional revenue from providing that cash flow immediately. So there's like different options here. I think that could definitely still be explored. Yeah, it's quite broad.
Super interesting
and exciting.
On that last idea, I guess another idea would be, I'm an organization, I need money today, I've got all of these animals generating revenue for me. I can go to someone and say, will you borrow me $1,000? You get all the revenue from these animals for the next 5 months. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, it could be an option as well. Like it's like that's also a way to do it.
And then the person who's borrowing has the risk of if those animals change price or whatever. But
it's like
an agreement.
like an interest rate swap in some capacity. Yeah.
Yeah. Do any of you
cool.
other guys in the call have a question?
Yeah, I do. Actually, there's one or two questions. Let me start off with this one first. Simon, so where do you think you're going next from here, experimenting in the Harberger space? You've released this Artworks Always for Sale V1, V2. Are there going to be more versions coming out, or have you given any thought to what you might look like dabbling in the space in the future?
I don't currently have plans to launch a new artwork, but I do think that there's still more experiments to be done. So I might do, say, different tax rate or or maybe experiment with one where you can invest back into the asset, invest back into the artwork by gaining certain privileges to edit the artwork. In terms of like artwork stuff, there is an art project that I still want to do. This was something I came up with like a few years back called Autonomous, which is sort of, you have like a DAO that's responsible for creating generative artworks, and the people that participate in this DAO basically learn and teach this generative artwork to make better art. And then obviously it sells it on Ethereum, and then there's this feedback loop where it makes art, people buy the art, the DAO gets more money, the DAO pays coders to improve its art, and then this sort of virtuous feedback loop. But the difficult part there at the moment for me is like learning generative art in general and learning how to draw these things in the browser. That's like the last hurdle. I just need to find like a weekend to play around with that stuff. I think it's really cool anyway, so I need to do it at some point. In terms of Harberger tax in general, I had an idea related to my novel. So I've been writing a novel for the past year, and I'm busy with revisions at the moment. And at the Radical Exchange conference, I gave sort of a detail on a key economic system in the city, which is like it's gridlock. There's like a constant gridlock, and the gridlock functions on Harberger tax. Like, so you can buy spots in the gridlock in this big traffic mess through Harberger tax. And one of the things I thought about, which would be cool, is like as an additional sort of just interesting thing to do with, is this, because this is a thematic thing in the novel, to just create like a thematic representation of that as part of the experience. So you can buy and sell collectible cars in a gridlock, just for fun, as something else to showcase it. But obviously I need to find time to do that too. So I don't know if I will do that or whether it's actually meaningful, but it's an idea I had. Otherwise, I think like a lot of the ideas and interest I had was basically, you guys took the lead and ran with it, and I just want to support you guys as much as possible to keep experimenting with these ideas, such that hopefully we get to a place where like we can definitely fund a lot more things in the public sphere and the commons through these sort of Harberger taxed collectibles.
Rad, yeah, no, that sounds awesome. Hopefully, for sure. And then on that, with Harberger tax collectibles, another thing I think that's super worth interesting, just thinking about for a second. So right now, our sort of yield farming mechanism, where if you own a wild card, you receive a Wildcards loyalty token for every day that you own that wild card. We gave a lot of thought into, we called it the token generation rate. What should it be for each wild card? And at the moment, for all of our wild cards, this rate is the same, and you receive 1 token for holding a wild card per day. But we were thinking a lot, like, should this token generation rate be linked to the Harberger tax rates? Does that come into play? And or something like that. I don't know. Maybe there's a very interesting link there. And I guess this also links into what other uses of the Wildcards loyalty token do we envision long term in the future. And I think the DAO governance is really one of the first use cases, and we've got lots of other ideas of how to use it in the future. But yeah, I know Jason also had some thoughts on this as well, and Denim.
Yeah, I think like liquidity mining and liquidity farming and it's like the sort of in thing right now. It makes a lot of it's the same feeling. Like if you own a wild card, you get access to this token that gives you certain new privileges and stuff like that. I like the fact that it's independent of the tax rates or prices, because what that does, it promotes the platform as a whole. And I think that's what you want, right? If you find like an animal that's neglected, that is not as popular, then that incentivizes people to go pick that one up. and ensure it survives.
Yeah, I think maybe that's something we haven't spoken about much is Harberger tax as firstly a signaling mechanism and secondly a form of governance. I mean, currently the governance in Wildcards is quite minimal, but ultimately we want to build something where the organizations that are most deserving and having the most impact get the most funds, and that's quite difficult. And there's a lot of experiments going on in the space with Gitcoin and such. But if one of the worries I have is if all the wild cards are very similar, they've got different stories, but they're all just animals and they're all cool and interesting. An organization that's almost defunct and the people are super lazy and doing nothing, just because they've got cool animals might get money. So, that's a really big concern. How do you see the intersection of governance and Harberger tax and signaling mechanisms and stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question, especially in the context of what you guys are doing, because in some ways, like you said, like someone would want to own an animal because of it's just a funky, cool animal, and maybe has like some nice artwork with it, versus something that maybe needs it more, like a different organization that really needs more funds versus the organization that can promote their animals, for example. So I think, I think at least initially, it's probably like not that strong a concern, but I think it would become a bigger problem as the platform grows. I haven't thought about the idea of combining, because like there are probably ways you can combine like Harberger tax with like different kind of funding models. Because like one of them would be something like, if say 50% of the funds go directly to the cause, like 50% of the tax revenue goes towards this organization that supports these animals, and then 50% goes into a fund that then the platform then decides how to disperse it. And then you can also then play with that too. It could be something like, like quadratic funding, right? Which is like if the institution that had the most unique, like the most unique number of users paying towards this organization gets more of the funds. Whereas sort of if there's one whale, not a real whale, one like financial whale owning all of a certain organization's fund, then maybe they should get less, right? Because then that's where you incorporate like quadratic funding to disbursement of these funds. So I think there is also an interesting way to look at it, or it could also just be traditional DAO where like the current holders of a token decides how the funds should be dispersed, the extra 50%. So there's probably different ways to do that too. But I think what's great, I think that's a great model in general, because it engenders sort of the support of the platform as a whole, not necessarily the sort of conservation of specific animals, specific organizations. I think it's a cool idea for people to also, having contributed to conservation, to participate in choosing as well.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. We've kind of thought of framing it kind of as social security for animals, where there's, as an example, it's not true today. I think the hyena's been bought, but for a long time we had 3 hyenas on our platform, and in media, hyenas are portrayed as these evil animals, and they're nasty, and they're just making jokes, from the Lion King or whatever. So those animals were severely underfunded compared to the more sort of popular animals. And we are thinking, wow, maybe we should actually make a fund for for there's a comment from
underrepresented animals.
Underrepresented animals. And turning that into a DAO is such a great idea.
Yeah, there's something else actually, because like one thing I thought about is like with regards to wildcards, like have you guys considered like different kinds of collectibles and not just animals to sort of support conservation? And I don't know if what that looks like. I have an idea, but I first want to hear from you guys if you guys given it any thought.
John, I can see on mic yourself.
No, I'll say 1 second, but I think Dan's going to say the same thing. Yeah, I think totally you could have like super cool rainforests and artworks and collectibles like that. Another thing we talked about, sorry Dan, I'll be quick, is crowdsourcing the artwork, and then you can have artworks of amazing rainforests that support land rehabilitation. I think a long-term goal is definitely to broaden it in sustainability and move beyond just animals. Animals is a great start. Yeah, go over it, Dan.
I can see we've got a comment from Griff, but I just wanted to mention we did a proof of concept with Carbon Credits Club, which is similar with conservation, but essentially the concept is if you have this rainforest in Ghana and you cut it into portions and into sections, and essentially you sell those plots as Harberger NFTs, and instead of getting Wildcards loyalty tokens, for example, the return would be the carbon credits that it offsets. So in this model, you could kind of have a conservation-based model where you have this plot of land and you're getting carbon credits by owning it, and then you can sell those on type thing. So quite a self-regulating economy for carbon credits. And we actually did a kind of a proof of concept in Berlin for diffusion. But do you want to come back to that comment that Griff came up with, Jason?
Comments are delayed. But yeah, it's like I sorry, I finished, Denim. I really like the idea of the forest, because that's like the thinking I had in mind as well for like as John said about land rehabilitation, or at least like contributing to sort of climate change and conservation of ecosystems, where like you had this model where someone plants a tree somewhere, right? And the revenue from its digital collectible counterpart, right, would fund people planting more trees. Once the next real tree is planted, you mint the new collectible, right? And so you have people actually putting in funds that is slowly building out a plantation of trees that you can own each tree. And then one thing I thought about as part of that is obviously to make it sort of, you can do it as a pure conservation play, right? You don't get access to anything else besides like funding the building of trees. But to make it sort of part of a self-regulating economy, part of it could be like, once a tree has reached its natural lifespan or something, then you can actually cut it off and sell it for wood, and that funds would go to someone who put revenue into the system. But the idea of like giving out carbon credits, that's brilliant. That's really awesome as part of the self-regulating economy. So you have this patronage system as well, but then also getting carbon credits back. That's really cool.
You get a return. I think it kind of was inspired by a video we saw on World Economic Forum, where essentially Norway paid Ghana to purchase the carbon emission returns from a huge portion of forest, and essentially those funds went into preserving those forests. So Norway offset its carbon, and Ghana received funds to conserve that forest land, which essentially, so they were able to sell the carbon credits, and we kind of mapped it in with Harberger tax. But John, is there something you want to?
Yeah, I chucked a comment to the link. You can actually check carbon credits out, what we built. And the way we envisioned it was with spec boom farming. And a farmer would plant all of the spec boom, and he would receive the patronage to tend to the spec boom and make spec boom farming profitable for him. And in return, the owner who's paying the patronage receives the ERC20 carbon credit tokens, which they can verifiably burn to offset their emissions. So yeah, we decided spec boom was a cool way to do it. Yeah, that was it. And I dropped the link in the comments. Oh, let me try to find it again.
I wanted to ask another kind of open question to anyone. But what other interesting use cases for Harberger tax have you thought of or come across? Or I know I've discussed one with John that I'll bring up in a bit, but if anyone else has any kind of interesting use cases of Harberger tax that might have come across or thought of.
Yeah, I have one.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, like Marvin, you haven't spoken the whole way. You can go.
No, I was just thinking about one thing I always find interesting is licensing. So in the area of maybe open source licensing for Harberger tax, like coupling usage rights or anything to NFTs and then renting them out is. I'm not aware of any like established project that does that. So that would be something that would be interesting to me to explore. So that is something there.
Yeah, that's I agree with that. Like I think like experimenting with license, especially open source licensing, where you are allowed to privately exploit the code. Like you're allowed to fork and make remixes of the code and keep it private whilst you're paying the license for it. And if you don't want to do it anymore, then you make it public, right? So then it's sort of, you pay a cost whilst you keep it private. So that's I like that too. What's the one I had? Oh, now I remember. I had a discussion with the CryptoVoxels, some of the CryptoVoxels community. So CryptoVoxels is this virtual world where you can own parcels in CryptoVoxels. So, and then once you own the parcel, you can modify it, add blocks to it, and so forth. And I was reading what Griff was saying. Yeah, all agree with all your comments, Griff. Definitely. And so in CryptoVoxels, the plots themselves is currently traditional property rights, completely private. Once you own it, you can decide what to do with it. So there's two ways, obviously, that you can approach Harberger tax here. Is like one is existing plots can maybe be use Harberger tax property rights, which is essentially what you would expect it to be. Like you own this virtual space, and if you pay some tax revenue, and all the tax revenue goes towards, say, production of content or development cost towards building out this virtual world. But I think there's another interesting model that the CryptoVoxels team was thinking about. And Jason, this comes back to a discussion about like how many collectibles should there be? Like they've been having discussions trying to figure out like how much land should they create, right? So the CryptoVoxels team built this like rectangular island, and then all the plots got sold. So now they're going, like, what should we do next regarding CryptoVoxels? Like, should we make new land? Should we make islands? What's the options that we have to increase the space? But obviously, there's a reason why it's valuable, because we made it scarce. So the question of like how much land should we now build additionally? And so one of the ideas I proposed is like, you can keep this island with the normal property rights, but build a new island with Harberger tax property rights, right? But then give people the option to mint new land if they want to, as long as it's attached to the island, right? So let's say you have the main island here, then to the side of it is another island. If you want to mint new property, you pay a certain amount, and then now you have this land, right? If someone wants to have new property, they mint like additional property next to it. And so this island would like organically grow based on sort of interest in proximity to other interesting things in this island. And then that would fund the development of CryptoVoxels. But then it would also have an interesting vector, which is the same thing about the collectibles discussion, which is if no one wants that piece of land anymore, the land gets destroyed. So then you would have this growing islands. It would like start growing into many islands and maybe connect again and like disconnect again. And it would just be a really interesting experiment. But I think why it's also cool is because you can do this without necessarily impacting what already exists in cryptovoxels. You know, years, traditional property rights, let's make a Harberger tax land, and then let's see what people do with it.
That's super fascinating. I actually did quite a lot of experimenting with cryptovoxels. Sure, now it must be maybe 6 months ago. And also, sadly, I don't have enough time. But I mean, I built basically two things, very connected with Harberger tax. One is an art gallery where the Harberger tax represents gallery space. So there's a square on the wall, and that square is a Harberger tax NFT. And when you own it, you get to put your art in that square. That was very cool. Yeah, I still need to go back to that when I get time.
Is it live? Is it live?
Yeah, it is live. I hope the server's running. There is a backend server, so it's that was my difficulty with cryptovoxels. You need to have some interaction with cryptovoxels for it to work. But anyway, yeah, that is live. And the other was cool. There's something called edit rights in cryptovoxels. So once again, you rely on cryptovoxels, and you know, it's not fully trustless, unfortunately. But you could have a parcel where you actually say anyone who owns this NFT has edit rights, and then you can go and build things. And there's something that I thought would be fascinating, which is only possible in digital worlds. You can actually revert the state of edits. So if you could build a really cool UI where you can access all the previous states of that voxel, and it's Harberger tax, you could go in, buy the Harberger tax, and directly change it to something that someone else built previously, which would be super cool. So yeah, I think that's awesome. Great. I think,
man, that's great. I like that.
I think the first use cases for Harberger tax personally are going to be a lot of digital things. I see Griff mentioned Ether. I'm going to show that quick. And I think that's interesting because that's an intersection between real life and digital, where there's a real life service that's controlled digitally. So I think possibly there's a lot of exploration there too. So sorry, I cut you off, Simon.
No. I completely agree. What I like about the editing rights and the fact that the history is still there is that ties into like the value of, or like why Harberger tax is proposed for certain assets, because it's about like managing rights over commons usage or like public usage. That's like a middle ground between like purely public or purely private. And the fact that you have access to the history of that thing is part of that experience of the commons. That's really cool. I like that. That's like, it just has this story to it. That's meaningful.
For sure. I think I'll actually go and check if that server's running and share a link. I think we basically should wrap it up. We've gone an hour. If there's any closing remarks from you guys, let me know. Otherwise, it's been absolutely fantastic. Go for it.
Cool. Jason, I just want to ask you to just add all those links into the YouTube details as well. And then the last idea that I spoke about with John a while back was using Harberger tax to essentially sell property on Mars. So essentially you have Mars as a planet and you divide it into segments.
Let's call Elon right now. Let's call Elon.
Sold. And the idea is that the funds that get generated from owning that plot of land can be used to maybe not have an army to protect it, but to facilitate that ownership, because essentially it's an unowned portion of land. But anyway, that's closing from my part. Thanks so much, Simon. Thanks, Jason and Marvin. And if anyone else has any other things they want to comment, but that's me. Cool.
Yeah, I think there's one thing to point out about the Mars thing. Is like there was the Japanese guy that worked with Elon Musk to fund that sort of the trip around the moon thing, and like you could buy seats in the spacecraft. I would just thought like, why don't you just sell it through a Harberger tax? Because what will happen is like that those funds that is for a future trip for a seat in the spacecraft can help fund this mission itself. You know.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And then even if you go like, actually, maybe I'm a bit nervous about going into space in a spacecraft, then you could still feel like you owned a part of this experience by just having bought and sold the seat for 10 days, what have you. Anyway, thank you very much, guys.
I think that's the cool thing. We don't want to drag this out, but there's a time element to Harberger tax. So another project we didn't mention is a new type of prediction market that a friend of mine is building, which is really cool.
Reality cards.
Reality cards. Yeah. So sorry we didn't speak about your project. Hopefully we can get you as a guest. So Simon has a great Twitter channel, so you can see actually a lot of the projects he mentioned I first heard about from his Twitter. So it was, what's it, Nifty-Fi or
Nifty-Fi, yeah.
Nifty-Fi.
NFT-FI, yeah.
And Centrifuge. Both of those I found out from Simon's tweets, so I recommend you take a look. Cheers, guys. Have a great weekend and see you next week.
Have a good one.
Good one.